Welcome to Relation Tales. Please like this video and subscribe Relation Tales that we're grateful for each and every one of you. Let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let's begin. The streets of Philadelphia were alive with the usual Friday night chaos. Honking cars, pedestrians hustling to their destinations, and the faint hum of distant music spilling out of nearby bars. But Daniel Brown didn't notice any of it. His attention was on the glowing menu board outside the Sheraton restaurant. He squinted, mentally calculating how far his meager savings would stretch. It was his 50th birthday, and for once, he wanted to treat himself. Inside, diners sat under crystal chandeliers, their laughter muffled by the thick glass separating Daniel from the world he hadn't been a part of in years. He tugged at the collar of his thrift store shirt, the stiff fabric itching against his neck. The corduroy jacket, a gift from the church's auxiliary ladies, felt oversized and foreign. Still, it was the nicest thing he owned, and tonight he wanted to feel like someone who belonged, if only for a few hours. Just as he stepped toward the door, a voice stopped him. "Excuse me," a woman said, her tone brisk yet polite. Daniel turned, startled. She was striking, tall, poised, and dressed in a tailored navy dress that spoke of sophistication and purpose. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached, her dark curls framing a face that held both authority and charm. "I couldn't help but notice you standing there," she continued, her eyes scanning him briefly. "Are you dining alone?" Daniel blinked, unsure how to respond. "Yes." "Why?" The corners of her mouth lifted into a practiced smile. "I have a bit of a situation and was hoping you could help." His eyebrows rose. "Help?" "Yes," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Marcia Nelson. I'm supposed to attend an awards ceremony at Empire Hall, but my planned chaperone canceled last minute. It's inconvenient, and frankly, I can't show up alone." Daniel stared at her, his mind scrambling to make sense of her words. "I'm sorry, but why are you asking me?" Marcia's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by something softer. "Because you're here. And because, quite honestly, I'm desperate." The absurdity of the situation hit him like a wave. A stranger, a polished, confident stranger, was asking him, a janitor from St. Vincent's Church, to play the role of her companion at what sounded like a high society event. He glanced down at his scuffed brown wingtips, feeling the weight of every wrinkle in his shirt. "Listen," Marcia said, sensing his hesitation. "The meal's already paid for, and all you'd have to do is sit with me, look charming, and nod politely through a few speeches. No strings attached. What do you say?" Daniel hesitated. His stomach growled, a not-so-subtle reminder of the canned soup waiting for him back at the church. And yet something about Marcia's earnestness, her refusal to treat him as anything less than an equal, stirred a long-buried part of him. He nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll do it." Marcia's face lit up. "Perfect. Let's go." She didn't give him time to reconsider, linking her arm through his and steering him down the street. Daniel barely had a chance to glance back at the Sheraton's menu before it disappeared from view. Empire Hall was a vision of grandeur. Marble floors gleamed under soft golden lights, and crystal chandeliers hung like jeweled crowns from the high ceilings. The hum of polite conversation filled the air as men in tailored suits and women in glittering gowns moved about with practiced elegance. Daniel followed Marcia closely, feeling like a fish out of water in his borrowed clothes. She seemed to glide effortlessly through the crowd, exchanging nods and smiles with people who looked at him with mild curiosity. "Don't worry," she whispered, sensing his unease. "You're doing great." They reached their table, where name cards identified Marcia as one of the evening's honorees. As they sat, Daniel tried to blend into the background, keeping his movements small and his gaze low. "Daniel, was it?" asked a man across the table, his voice friendly but probing. "Yes," Daniel replied, offering a small smile. "Marcia didn't mention you earlier. Are you two together?" Before Daniel could respond, Marcia leaned in, her voice smooth as silk. "Daniel is my guest for the evening, a good friend and an excellent conversationalist." The man raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Daniel felt a rush of gratitude toward Marcia for deflecting the question so effortlessly. As the night progressed, Daniel began to relax. The speeches, though long, gave him a chance to observe Marcia. She was charming and articulate, her presence commanding respect without demanding it. When she laughed at something the keynote speaker said, it was genuine, not the forced politeness he had come to expect from people in her position. For the first time in years, Daniel felt normal. Later, as they exited the hall, Marcia handed him a small box wrapped in gold paper. "What's this?" Daniel asked, confused. "A thank you gift," she said, smiling. "You saved me tonight. I figured it's only fair I return the favor." Daniel hesitated, then opened the box. Inside was a silver pen, elegant and understated. He stared at it, unsure what to say. "Happy birthday," Marcia added softly, surprising him. "How did you—" "You mentioned it earlier," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I have a good memory." For the first time that night, Daniel laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that echoed in the quiet street. The pen felt cold in Daniel's pocket as he walked back to St. Vincent's that night. The warmth of Marcia's kindness lingered, but it was quickly eclipsed by the chill of memory creeping into his chest. Birthdays had never been extravagant for him, just small dinners with Caroline and Claire, maybe a thoughtful gift. But this night felt like a mirror, reflecting the man he had become against the shadow of the man he once was. The bell above the church door jingled softly as he entered. The hall was quiet, save for the distant hum of Father Doyle's radio. Daniel's footsteps echoed faintly as he walked down the narrow corridor to his small, sparse room in the basement. He collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling, and allowed himself to remember. The sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of their Westchester home, casting delicate patterns on the walls. The house was warm and comfortable, the kind of place Daniel had always dreamed of having. He had worked hard for it, endless hours as an actuary, crunching numbers to ensure a stable future for his family. "Morning, sweetheart," Caroline said, setting a mug of coffee on the kitchen table. She kissed his cheek absently, her lips cool and impersonal. "Morning," Daniel replied, hiding the sting of her distance. The days of warm embraces and shared laughter had faded over the years. Caroline's job at Bixler Enterprises demanded long hours, and she seemed to thrive in that world. Her sharp wit and quick charm made her indispensable to the company's CEO, Carl Bixler, a man Daniel had only met twice and disliked both times. Their daughter, Claire, was the glue that held them together. Even as a teenager, she had a way of diffusing tension with her bright smile and boundless energy. But when she left for college that September, the cracks in Daniel and Caroline's marriage widened into chasms. It was a Friday evening when the truth shattered his world. Daniel had come home early, excited to surprise Caroline with takeout from her favorite Italian restaurant. He imagined her smiling for the first time in weeks, maybe even laughing at one of his corny jokes. But as he entered the house, the sound of a suitcase being zipped broke through his thoughts. Caroline stood in the foyer, dressed impeccably as always. A suitcase sat at her feet, its wheels gleaming against the polished floor. "Going somewhere?" Daniel asked, his voice light, but tinged with confusion. She didn't look at him. "I'm heading to the Poconos for the weekend." "Work trip?" "No," she replied, her tone flat. "I'm going with Carl." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Daniel felt his heart stop, his mind scrambling to process what she had just said. "Carl Bixler?" he asked, as though there might be another Carl she was referring to. "Yes." She finally met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I thought it was time to be honest with you. Carl and we've been seeing each other for a while." "A while? How long was a while? Months? Years?" Daniel's mind raced, cycling through every moment over the past year that hadn't made sense. The late nights at the office, the sudden weekend conferences, the way she avoided his touch. It all fell into place with horrifying clarity. "You're serious," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I'm serious," Caroline replied. "I didn't want it to come out like this, but you deserve to know." "Deserve? What did he deserve? Betrayal? Humiliation? What about us?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. "What about Claire?" "Claire's an adult now," Caroline said dismissively. "She'll understand eventually." And as for us, Daniel, there hasn't been an us for a long time. Her words struck him like a physical blow. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, but the fight drained out of him. When will you be back? He asked numbly. Caroline hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know. She picked up her suitcase and walked out the door without another word. Daniel stood frozen in the foyer, the faint scent of her perfume lingering like a ghost. The next day, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers Caroline had left behind. She hadn't even waited for his response. The papers were unsigned, a declaration of her intention to erase him from her life without discussion. Daniel's eyes moved to the wedding photo on the mantel. They had looked so happy that day, their smiles genuine and full of promise. What had gone wrong? Had he been too busy? Too blind? Or had Caroline simply stopped loving him without telling him? By Sunday, Daniel had packed a single suitcase. He left the house key on the kitchen counter and walked out, leaving behind the life he had built. Daniel closed his eyes, the weight of those memories pressing down on him. Caroline's betrayal had hollowed him out, leaving him a shell of the man he once was. But Marcia's words from earlier in the evening echoed in his mind. You're more than you think you are. You've just forgotten. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to wonder if that could be true. The basement of St. Vincent's Church was small and dimly lit, but it offered Daniel something he hadn't realized he needed: anonymity. The creak of his cot as he sat down felt like a whisper of his new life. Unadorned, utilitarian, and, most importantly, quiet. When Daniel had first approached Father Doyle, seeking work and shelter, he hadn't expected much. The priest had studied him with curious eyes, a gentle but probing gaze that seemed to see past the facade Daniel tried to wear. Why here? Doyle had asked, folding his hands over his desk. Daniel hesitated before answering. I need to start over. Somewhere simple. Somewhere unconnected to my past. Father Doyle nodded, seemingly satisfied. We can use someone handy around the church. It's not much: room, board, and a modest stipend. But you'll earn your keep. I'm not looking for much, Daniel replied quietly. And so, Daniel's new life began. His days were filled with routine tasks: scrubbing the sanctuary's stone floors, repairing broken pews, and fixing leaky faucets in the soup kitchen. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the storm in his mind. Each morning, Daniel rose before dawn. He would light a candle in the church's main hall, the flickering flame casting long shadows over the altar. The silence of the early hours felt like a balm, soothing the ache he couldn't quite articulate. Morning, Daniel. Father Doyle would greet him as he passed by with his coffee. Morning, Father, Daniel would reply, offering a small nod. He liked the simplicity of their exchanges. There were no prying questions, no expectations beyond the work that needed to be done. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel found himself blending into the rhythm of the church. The parishioners came to know him as a quiet but reliable presence. Some would greet him warmly, while others would simply nod in passing. It was enough. The auxiliary ladies who ran the thrift store and organized charity events often left small gifts for him: a sweater that looked like his size or a pair of sturdy work boots. Daniel accepted these gestures with quiet gratitude, though he rarely used anything beyond what was absolutely necessary. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And for a man who felt he had lost his identity, it was a start. The nights were harder. Alone in his small room, with only the hum of the old radiator for company, Daniel's mind often wandered back to the life he had left behind. He thought of Claire and wondered if she resented him for disappearing. He thought of Caroline and tried to make sense of her betrayal. He thought of their home in Westchester, wondering if she had filled it with memories that didn't include him. Some nights, the weight of it all felt unbearable. He would sit by the small window in his room, staring at the faint glow of streetlights outside, and ask himself if leaving had been the right choice. But the alternative, staying in a house filled with echoes of love turned cold, felt even worse. One afternoon, about 6 months into his new life, Father Doyle approached Daniel with an unusual request. Daniel, he said, leaning against the doorway of the storeroom where Daniel was organizing supplies. We've been invited to a community meeting about the homeless crisis in the area. I'd like you to come with me. Daniel frowned. Me? Why? You've been working closely with our homeless center, Doyle said. You understand their needs better than most. Your perspective would be valuable. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, or even the room where decisions were made. I'm not sure I'd be much help, he said. You might surprise yourself, Doyle replied with a knowing smile. Reluctantly, Daniel agreed. The meeting was held in a small conference room at the local community center. Around the table sat city officials, nonprofit leaders, and a few local activists. Daniel felt out of place among them, his thrift store clothes a stark contrast to their polished appearances. But as the discussion began, something shifted. One of the officials dismissed an idea about expanding the church's soup kitchen, citing budget concerns. Daniel, who had seen firsthand the impact the kitchen had on the community, found himself speaking up. With all due respect, he said, his voice steady but firm, the soup kitchen isn't just about feeding people. It's about dignity. It's about letting people know they're seen and cared for. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. For a moment, Daniel felt exposed, but then he saw a few heads nodding in agreement. By the end of the meeting, Father Doyle clapped him on the shoulder. You did good, Daniel. Really good? For the first time in years, Daniel felt a flicker of pride. As the months went by, Daniel began to rediscover parts of himself he thought were lost. He took on more responsibilities at the church, overseeing repairs and helping coordinate events. The community came to respect him, not just as the quiet janitor, but as a man who genuinely cared. Still, there was a part of him that remained guarded. He had built a life of quiet stability, but the scars of his past hadn't faded. And then Marcia Nelson walked into his life, shattering the fragile equilibrium he had built. The soft light of early evening bathed the streets of Philadelphia as Daniel walked alongside Marcia. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement, a sound that seemed to underscore her confident stride. Daniel, in contrast, felt acutely aware of every step he took, conscious of his ill-fitting shoes and thrift store ensemble. So, Daniel, Marcia began, breaking the silence. What's your story? Daniel tensed. It wasn't the first time someone had asked him that since he started his new life at St. Vincent's, but it was the first time he cared about the opinion of the person asking. Not much to tell, he said, keeping his voice neutral. Marcia glanced at him sideways, her eyes sharp and probing. Come on, everyone has a story. You don't seem like the type to end up working at a church by accident. Daniel hesitated, then offered a small smile. Maybe another time. Marcia didn't press further, and he was grateful. They arrived at the entrance to Empire Hall, the grand venue gleaming with polished brass and marble. A doorman greeted Marcia with a nod and opened the door for them. Daniel followed her inside, feeling like a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. The room buzzed with activity. Men in sharp suits and women in glittering gowns mingled, their laughter and conversation blending into a low, pleasant hum. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the space, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Marcia navigated the crowd with ease, offering polite nods and quick greetings. Daniel trailed behind her, trying to look inconspicuous. Relax, Marcia said, leaning toward him as they reached their table. You're doing fine. I feel like I'm sticking out like a sore thumb, Daniel muttered. You're not, she replied with a reassuring smile. Trust me, the table was already occupied by several people, most of whom greeted Marcia warmly. She introduced Daniel as her guest for the evening, a phrase that raised a few eyebrows but didn't invite any direct questions. As the evening progressed, Daniel found himself listening more than speaking. The conversations around the table were lively, ranging from business strategies to local politics. Daniel felt out of his depth, but managed to contribute a few polite comments when asked. Marcia, for her part, seemed entirely at ease. She laughed easily, her wit and charm drawing people in. Daniel couldn't help but admire her confidence, though it also made him painfully aware of his own insecurities. As the event wound down, Marcia turned to Daniel. Let's step outside for a bit. It's getting stuffy in here. They found a quiet spot on the balcony, the cool night air a welcome relief from the warmth of the crowded hall. Marcia leaned against the railing, her expression thoughtful. "You did great tonight," she said. "Better than I expected. Honestly." Daniel chuckled softly. "Thanks, I think." She smiled, then grew serious. "You're not like most people I meet at these events. There's a groundedness to you. It's refreshing." Daniel looked out at the city lights, unsure how to respond. "I guess life is a way of grounding you," he said after a moment. Marcia tilted her head, studying him. "You're not going to tell me, are you? What happened to you?" "It's not a story for tonight," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. She nodded, seeming to accept his answer. "Fair enough." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the distant sounds of the city filling the space between them. 2 weeks later, Marcia returned to St. Vincent's. Daniel was in the middle of repairing a pew when she appeared in the doorway, her sharp silhouette backlit by the afternoon sun. "Busy?" she asked, a teasing lilt in her voice. Daniel straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Always. What brings you here?" "I need another favor," she said, stepping into the church. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Another event?" "Sort of," she replied. "There's a charity auction next weekend, and I'd rather not go alone." Daniel hesitated. The evening at Empire Hall had been pleasant enough, but the thought of stepping into another high society event made him uneasy. Marcia must have sensed his hesitation because she added, "It's a small event. Local artists mostly. Nothing as fancy as last time." He sighed. "I don't have anything to wear." She grinned. "Leave that to me." The charity auction was held in a smaller, more intimate venue. True to Marcia's word, it lacked the opulence of Empire Hall, but it was no less vibrant. Paintings and sculptures lined the walls, each tagged with starting bids. The crowd was smaller and more relaxed, their conversations tinged with genuine enthusiasm rather than calculated networking. Marcia led Daniel through the room, stopping occasionally to examine a piece of art or greet someone she knew. "What do you think of this one?" she asked, pointing to a painting of a sunset over the city. Daniel studied it for a moment. "It's nice. Simple, but comforting." Marcia smiled. "Good eye. I think I'll bid on it." They continued browsing, the easy rhythm of their conversation surprising Daniel. He felt less like an outsider this time, more like a participant. At one point, Marcia turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You're good at this, you know." "At what?" "Blending in," she said. "You might not think so, but you have a way of making people comfortable." Daniel shrugged. "I'm just trying not to embarrass you." "You couldn't if you tried," she replied with a wink. After the auction, Marcia insisted on treating Daniel to dinner at a small local restaurant. The setting was cozy and unpretentious, a welcome contrast to the grandeur of their previous outing. Over plates of pasta and glasses of wine, their conversation grew more personal. "Why do you do it?" Daniel asked suddenly. "Do what?" Marcia replied, swirling her wine. "These events, the auctions, the galas, why do you care so much?" She considered his question for a moment. "I guess I've always believed that if you have the ability to help, you should. Not everyone gets a fair shot in life. If I can tip the scales, even just a little, it's worth it." Daniel nodded, her words resonating with him more than he expected. "What about you?" she asked. "Why St. Vincent's?" He hesitated, then offered a small smile. "It's a long story." Marcia leaned forward, her eyes glinting with curiosity. "I've got time." A month later, Daniel's quiet world was disrupted once more. Seymour Schlumpf, a name and face from his past, appeared at a local charity event Marcia had invited him to. The moment Seymour spotted him, his booming voice filled the room. "Danny boy!" Seymour exclaimed, wrapping Daniel in a bear hug. "I almost didn't recognize you with that beard." Daniel froze, caught between embarrassment and irritation. Seymour's sudden presence felt like a jolt back to a life he had spent years trying to leave behind. As introductions were made, Seymour wasted no time catching Daniel up on his financial situation. "You know," Seymour said with a sly grin, "your ex-wife didn't touch a cent of your investments. I've been managing them all this time. You're sitting on a nice little nest egg, my friend." Daniel's stomach churned at the mention of Caroline. He hadn't thought of her in months, but Seymour's revelation brought her back to the forefront of his mind. "She divorced you 3 years ago," Seymour continued, lowering his voice. signed everything over without a fight. Guess her new man didn't want the baggage. Marcia's sharp eyes flicked to Daniel. Is this the same Caroline you mentioned? The one who left? Daniel nodded stiffly. She's still with this guy? Marcia asked, her tone casual but laced with curiosity. Seymour smirked. Oh, she's still with him. Carl Bixler. Rich as sin, but not for much longer. Word is his health's failing, and Caroline's been running the show. If you ask me, it's only a matter of time before the house of cards collapses. Later that night, Daniel sat with Marcia, the pieces of a plan forming in his mind. Why didn't you tell me? She asked softly. Daniel sighed. What was there to say? She betrayed me. I left. In a story. Marcia leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with determination. It doesn't have to be the end. You have the resources now, Daniel. The power to take back what she tried to steal from you. Not just your money, but your dignity. Her words struck a chord. Over the next few weeks, with Marcia's legal expertise and Seymour's insider knowledge, Daniel began to lay the groundwork for his revenge. The plan was precise and ruthless. First, Daniel reclaimed his old home in Westchester, evicting the tenants and putting it up for sale. The proceeds were funneled into a series of charitable donations under his name, subtly outshining Caroline's public persona. Next came the financial maneuvers. Seymour uncovered discrepancies in the Bixler Company's accounts, evidence of Caroline's mismanagement disguised as oversight. Daniel anonymously forwarded the information to a journalist known for exposing corporate fraud. The final step was personal. At a high-profile gala where Caroline was set to receive an award for her philanthropic efforts, Daniel made his move. Caroline looked radiant as she took the stage, her practiced smile hiding the chaos Daniel knew was brewing behind the scenes. As she began her speech, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Whispers of the exposé published that morning filled the room, tarnishing her pristine reputation. Daniel watched from the sidelines, satisfaction coursing through him. When Caroline's voice faltered, he stepped forward, locking eyes with her. Daniel, she stammered, the microphone amplifying her shock. Surprised to see me? He asked, his tone calm but cutting. The crowd turned to watch as Daniel detailed her betrayal and deceit, his voice steady and clear. Caroline's mask slipped, revealing the desperation beneath. By the time he finished, her carefully constructed world had crumbled. With the revenge complete, Daniel felt an unexpected sense of peace. He sold his remaining assets, donated a portion to St. Vincent's, and focused on building a new life with Marcia. Their relationship deepened as they navigated their past wounds together. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to hope for a future filled with love and purpose. He also reached out to Claire, beginning the slow process of reconciliation. Though their relationship was tentative, it held the promise of healing. A year later, Daniel and Marcia stood in a small chapel surrounded by friends and family. As they exchanged vows, Daniel felt the weight of his past finally lift. Looking into Marcia's eyes, he saw not just love, but a reflection of the man he had become, stronger, wiser, and finally free. The journey had been long and painful, but it had brought him here, to a place of renewal and hope. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt whole.